Welcome to It Came from the Grove, our paranormal, weird history, and world folklore podcast. I am Wistmoor, illustrator of wonders, fairy researcher, and strange news hunter. Tonight, author David J. West is with us to have some fun trepanning for gold in the wilds of Utah. We're talking about the weird, the strange, and about most specifically the mysterious Skinwalker phenomenon. David, could you provide an introduction to everybody, who you are, and a little bit about your published works?
Sure. I'm David J. West. I write whatever strikes my fancy. Might be dark fantasy, weird westerns, and it's all because the voices in my head won't go quiet until somebody else can hear them. And by hearing them, that usually means reading them, but there are audiobooks too. I'm a big fan of pulp fiction, sword and sorcery, ghosts, lost ruins, so of course I find myself in Utah at the moment, but I've been raised all over the American West.
Ah, okay.
I have lost track of how many books I've written, in part because I've written a lot of short stories too, and every now and again I'll collect up my shorts and put those in a volume. And so sometimes there's a varied amount of books out there because I might have a story in one, and then I might have another that's a collection.
Yeah,
And
and you write a lot of weird westerns?
yeah, it's ended up being one of my more popular things. So I enjoy it because I'll take my own experiences out in the wild somewhere and use a place that I've been to and then do a fictitious action adventure pulpy type story
Okay,
in that place I've been.
I got you. So before we go into the mystery surrounding Skinwalkers and Skinwalker Ranch, what's your personal interest in that location and the phenomenon?
I've just always been interested because I as a kid I was always wanting to know about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness monster and whatever was weird and strange just captured my imagination. And I read so many books when I was a kid, and I think the first time I heard about Skinwalker Ranch had to be in the late '90s because it was mentioned on a local radio show that was paranormal. Clyde Lewis had a local show, Ground Zero, on our K Bear 101 Hard Rock Radio before he went a little more national, and he mentioned it. And I'm like, oh, we got something right over here. I gotta go check this out.
Nice.
And
And
I,
maybe you could help me out with a little bit with the history of it, because I heard that there was like a dispute. This is land. The Skinwalker Ranch is land that was owned or populated by the Ute tribe, and there was a
yeah,
dispute between the Navajo and the Utes. Um, Partnered with the U.S. government and drove the Navajo off. And then supposedly the mythology or the legend says that the Navajo summoned their own skinwalker in revenge for being kicked off the land.
yeah, that's part of the story. Is that the Navajo felt like they had been betrayed by the Utes, who kind of sold them out to the white man. So there's that aspect that they were cursed, and part of the curse was having skinwalkers, which at one time had been benevolent for the tribe, to be a negative dark force. And the Navajo call it Yenaglushi, and I'm spacing what the Ute name is, but they equally talk about the skinwalker and the path of the skinwalker, and that this area around this mesa is one of the hot spots where it's like the veils are thin.
Oh,
And
okay.
over time, this land has been owned by lots of different people. They even think that a Chinese merchant owned part of the property, like 100 years ago, because they found Chinese coins and things there. And then it eventually went from native holding it to different people owning sections of the land, and at this point, then it got famous with the Shermans, and then the NIDS guys bought it. And I think that's when I first heard about it, was in the 90s, but it goes way back to grievances between the tribes.
Yeah, and it
And
hadn't always been called the Skinwalker Ranch. I think it was like in '96 when they named it over to Skinwalker Ranch.
yeah, because before that, the Sherman family had it, and then before that, when they bought it, they thought, oh, this would be a great place to have a little cattle ranch, because they've got a creek running right at the base of the mesa, and they've got grass, and so they thought it'd be a good ideal place for cattle. But they're like, this place is strange. Why are the doors all have these extra locks and things?
Yeah, so
It's
I'm using some secret tech here to look down on Skywalker Ranch. And is it that the Dry Gulch Creek that you're talking about down there?
yeah,
So we've got Skinwalker Ranch here. I don't know what the Skinwalker Triangle is, and you said Sherman Point. So it's a pretty
well,
wide area.
yeah. And that's the area that they focus on the TV show, which I haven't really watched, but I'm aware of it.
Now, one thing I see here that's very curious, and maybe it has a simple explanation, is what is with all these huge circles?
That's irrigation.
Okay.
So they'll have big irrigation pipes, and they will pivot from that center point and turn. And the lines you see are the wheels that they keep. It's a big compass, and the thing turns and irrigates that land so that it gets more moisture for the sake of grazing and cattle and whatever they might be harvesting. Might be corn, but a lot of time it's just alfalfa and grass for the cattle.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, it did look very strange on the map, and we've got it right next to a UFO campground.
Yeah, I've had to laugh when I've seen people who fly over the United States and they're looking out the window and they're like, why are there all these circles? And it's like, it's just irrigation.
I see. All right. So you mentioned you had some personal experience with Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah, I got to go camp up on the mesa about a year and a half ago. So we were probably closer over to where that first circle is that you were showing us, because no, to the left, I guess. But anyway, yeah, right there they do little tours, and you can camp in that area close to your mouse right there.
Okay.
And we got to spend the night, and in the night we walked up on the mesa just to check things out. And I wanted to be creeped out so bad. I was hoping we'd experience something, batteries draining, something, and it just felt so good. I can't explain it. The vibe was like, oh, I feel good being here. This place feels awesome.
Like it was energizing, electrifying.
Yeah, it just felt good. I was hoping to get some material to write creepy stories about. And we heard stories that some of the people had seen shadow beings. I wasn't hearing any firsthand stuff about skinwalkers or werewolves or dogmen, but I was hearing a lot. People had seen a lot of shadow people.
Wow. Okay.
And but when I was there, I was hoping to get something creepy I could use, and it just felt good. It felt energizing. It was November, and it was cold, but it still felt really good. And we walked all over the mesa at night, just trying to experience it and feel the place. Complete opposite of what I was expecting. And then when we finally went to sleep around our campfire, in the middle of the night, the wind came up and knocked one of our chairs into the fire, and I had to roll over and pull it out, and it kind of melted. But and we even experimented with things. A friend of mine had something that he thought would help call down the aliens, and he experimented with that, and we didn't experience any aliens. I was open for it, but no. The weirdest thing that I can say is that when we were planning the trip, the thought went through my head about, what if I did something where I cut myself to be like a blood ritual where I would call something. And on the drive up, my friend Sean said that he had the same feeling.
Huh.
And it's like, this is not a normal thing. I don't normally ever think about, oh, maybe I myself to do a blood ritual. I never think that. That never goes through my head. And that equally for Sean, he's like, that's not something I think about. It's not something I do as a magical practice. I mean, I'm aware that some people do, but it's nothing. But the thought each came to us. And then when we got up there and we were doing the tour guide lady said that sometimes people come up there and try to do, like a blood sacrifice to commune. And we're like, what the heck? Where is this thought coming from? What entity is trying to feed that thought to us?
Yeah.
Are they acting something?
And in the legends, it talks about how the skinwalkers feed off of certain emotions. So that is interesting that you have like some kind of uh, shared experiences that are uh, somewhat like emotional based.
Yeah, and it really made me wonder because I live a couple odd hours away, so I'm not super close by, but I'm not really far either. By by Western Utah standards, I'm not that far, but it's a couple hours, 2.5 hours or so. And that's just not a thought that goes through my head, but it made me wonder if there's entities out there that are asking, hinting, putting that thought in your head of, hey, why don't you do this?
Yeah,
Maybe you talk to us better.
and you mentioned it was kind of like seems like a place between worlds where the boundaries are thin. Um,
Yeah, I really wonder that.
what kind of experiences are people having here aside from the skinwalkers and aliens and shadow people? It sounds like it's all over the place.
It I've read on some things where people get the impression that stuff can come in and out, like there's doorways and portals, and I'm fascinated with that. The idea um that something might open up and come through, and that makes it a sacred place because you don't know what's going to come through. It might be something beneficial. It doesn't have to be negative. And I'd like to think that that's possible, that maybe there can be good things coming through doorways too. And like I said, my experience, I felt energized and good being there. I wasn't creeped out at all. And the idea that there can be different things that come through really opens a lot of possibilities. And that's why I wonder about, it might depend on your outlook, it might depend on your experience.
Yeah,
Lots of stories where people that were doing investigative work said that there could be things that might follow them home, and we wondered about that, but we never experienced anything following us home, in the aftermath. But I also feel like we went with a pretty positive outlook. We weren't scared to be there. We weren't asking for trouble. We
yeah.
did not do any blood sacrifices.
But they do say that the best way to fend off a skinwalker is to actually confront them because they do feed off of that fear. And if you run or are fearful is when they see you as prey. And
Oh, for sure. I definitely think there's something to be said for if you give into the fear, you're giving them power over you.
right.
And I definitely have known of people that I've talked with natives that have said, they saw something and, they had to bring up their defenses and rebuke them. And then they were able to kind of pop out of the hypnotizing like spell and go on their way, because otherwise that thing might, sit there and dominate their will. It was intriguing, to hear about it firsthand from some people that have had those kind of experiences.
Yeah, and it's probably good that you didn't give in to the thought to give a blood sacrifice because, like we have a chatter here
Yeah,
saying, good things don't
blind
usually
that
come through
that would
that.
be negative entity
Yeah.
sort. But I have heard stories about people that did, and I've been anxious to try and hear their side of it, their story, because I've heard of people that have done that, but I don't have any firsthand experience with that.
Um, so you've had some experiences there, some and talking with people. Have you done like any sort of research, or do you know about any sources that are good to look into more about the skinwalker phenomenon?
Um, the best thing I've found is when I meet someone that's from the area or native that's dealt with that. I usually, if I can feel like I kind of have a rapport with them, I've asked. And, I've had different jobs where I've worked with some natives, and I would, once I got to a comfort level with them, I would say, hey, would you tell me anything that you know about this? And, it's like I've had a few that have told me, hey, this story, that story, because they're the older they are, the more apprehensive they are, but the younger generation has been a little more open to talking about skinwalkers, and so I've gotten it straight from some younger natives of experiences that they've had with skinwalker like entities, and it's one of those things where it's like, I should probably put this into a book besides just into stories, because I've gotten some good stories that, as far as I know, nobody's ever written them down or told them, so I probably need to do that.
Yeah, and that's a great observation, because we do a lot of folklore here on this podcast, and this is modern folklore where you're getting it from the folk that have those legends and modern day experiences. So it shows that folklore doesn't have to be fairy tales and like old fantasy fiction.
Yeah, yeah. And it's definitely there was a belief, and a comfort level of, when you have a rapport with them, that they'll be willing to tell you something, because I'd heard stories about, uh people would be cursing other people on the reservation, and they could find, somebody put something like a dead little fish on somebody's truck, up under the grill, where it would never a fish could never get there. No amount of driving through a stream or anything would ever force a little fish to get in a certain place, but it's part of a sorceress ritual to curse an individual and make them wreck
Oh wow.
for the occasion that, somebody else could take advantage of their misfortune. And that there's good medicine men and dark sorcerers, skinwalkers. It's definitely a part of their culture, because they're very close to the land. They're outside more than your typical American, and they're dealing with stuff out in the land. And I think there's something to be said for being closer to nature and more in tune, both for good and bad that way.
Right. And these skinwalkers are sort of like wild, just gone to its extreme, where they're hunting down prey and um, just sort of like the rabid side of the wild.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, it might be your neighbor who's just down the road,
Okay.
and you think that he's just some old Indian who lives just down the road, but he's also getting paid to put curses on people.
Oh, I see.
And the problem is that, if you called him out on it, like if you found out that you were cursed by so and so, and you went and called him out on it, then he'd have this bad karmic repercussions that could come back at him. So they do try to keep it a secret, but it seems like there must be some way of knowing that my cousin said that you should go talk to so and so. Maybe he can help lift a curse, and maybe he was paid to put the curse on you in the first place.
Right.
You know, there
So it's like his own racket.
back and forth on this.
And welcome Yannick and Melantris to chat. If you have any questions, feel free to share them here. We're keeping an eye on it. And I'll keep an eye on chat for you, so you don't have to look everywhere and try to figure out what's going on.
That's great, because I'm ignorant with Discord.
No worries. So do you know about any sort of government research into UFOs or Skinwalker Ranch that's currently ongoing?
Well, with the NIDS people that had it beforehand, they definitely were in bed with the government. And when they eventually sold to Brandon Fugel, and his operation that are now doing the TV show and things. They've monetized it. You can't even use the term Skinwalker for anything in around here anymore because they've trademarked it that it's their baby.
Well, I'm sure.
And I would assume that they're still tied in somewhere with some government research, but I don't think it's quite like it used to be. I figure if the NIDS people sold it, they must have felt like they got about as much as they could, but they didn't share any of their previous information. You know, we're talking from the 90s and the aughts. They didn't share it with the new owners at all.
Could you tell us what the NIDS are?
Let me think of it's an acronym, and I'm trying to remember exactly how they pronounce it, but it's like NIDS.
National Institute for Discovery Science, is that it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. That's right.
Oh, it looks like George Knapp is involved with this as well.
Yeah, George Knapp was the one that helped initially break the story when he first heard about it from the Shermans and the Gormans. And then George Knapp and Colm Kelleher kind of brought it forward in a book, Hunt for the Skinwalkers, because they went and spent time there and helped kind of break the story for the first time back in the 90s.
Yeah, and George Knapp is like this journalist ufologist, and he came up recently over last summer with the government hearings about UFOs.
Yeah, and he's also the one that kind of broke the story about Bob Lazar back in the 90s too, if you're familiar with him.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't have like that level of history with all of the strange, so I'm glad you're well to know.
Bob Lazar was supposedly working out in Area 51 and saw some UFOs. He was supposed to be doing the reverse engineering stuff. And when he came forward on Las Vegas TV, it was through George Knapp too.
Okay.
So George Knapp was, really on the cutting edge in the 90s, bringing some of this stuff forward.
So this NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science, they had like a commercial interest in Skinwalker Ranch.
Yeah, because their owner, I want to say Bob Bigelow.
Yeah, Robert Bigelow.
He's kind of like Elon Musk, fascinated with space and all that. He's super rich. And so he was interested in buying the property, and his company is NIDS, that's the acronym. And they, were doing all their tests, setting up cameras, trying to watch for portals, trying to set up tests to watch for anything strange, more so they could learn anything possible to, what can we learn about this place and this experience that we can utilize for technology, because they must have trusted what the Gorman/Sherman said enough to really look into it and buy the property for the sake of testing out these theories, because the things were so strange, of cattle disappearing and being mutilated, a giant wolf that came up and started attacking a calf, and then they would shoot it and bullets wouldn't have any effect. A lot of UFO stuff, sighting of portals, different skinwalkers being seen on the property.
Yeah, it's crazy the amount of just paranormal stuff reported on from there, because I don't think there's anywhere else in the U.S. that kind of has this level of strangeness.
Yeah, it's definitely what they call a hot spot, and that's why I was excited when the opportunity came to go and camp and spend the night there on the mesa. I was like, yeah, I'll do it. Let's go. And talking to the gal that was giving us a tour, she grew up around there, and she's like, I've never seen anything, but my husband grew up right here, and he's been creeped out enough times seeing shadow people and things ever since he was a kid. So it's something that's been ongoing, for decades, way before it was known to the public at all. So, and that's where I'm fascinated about the Indian legends going farther back, the native legends of, rivalries between the Utes and the Navajo and curses. And then in Knapp's book, he even talks about how, there might have been something to do with Buffalo soldiers that were there too, that might have had their own influence culturally, because they were into Haitian voodoo and all that.
Oh wow, that's a whole another element I hadn't heard about.
Yeah, supposedly, we're going back, oh boy, probably at least 150 years or more. The African American Buffalo Soldiers were stationed in the area as well.
Wow. Yeah, so yeah, this not only is this like a hotspot for strangeness, but it also has been like a highly contested land.
Yeah, very, very diverse. Peoples have been on it, and lots of different experiences back and forth, and all kinds of wild things where when the ranchers were there, they might see a young heifer and they'd walk past it, and then 5 minutes later they'd come back and it was dead and mutilated. And nothing that we know of human could do it that fast and clean without you hearing it or seeing it. So it definitely throws in that alien portal idea that something took it, did the mutilation and all that, and then drops it right back where it was in a time that's just blindingly fast.
Yeah, and the Skinwalker legend I think is most famous for being a Navajo legend, but it is also something that's among the Utes, like you said, they have their own name for it, and the Hopi also have similar legends. Do you think this is like a shared experience that these tribes have had, or would it be more like a example of cultural diffusion?
I'd be willing to say that it's kind of a little bit of both, where they all are aware of this, that that there are people that can talk to the spiritual side of things a bit better for good and bad, and that they're just aware that there's these spiritual forces in nature, elemental forces that some people can commune with and manipulate and cope a bit better than others.
And do you know of any like common misconceptions that we could straighten out about skinwalkers?
Hmm. What about misconceptions? I've just heard so many different stories. It's like I've talked with people that have personally seen like giant wolves. When I say giant, it's just much bigger than your average dog.
Okay.
You know, they've seen them, and it makes no sense because there shouldn't be wolves there, but there are, that are these big things they've been seeing. But then there's also seeing what looks like people dressed in skins that are doing things, and I don't know that I could actually straighten out any misconception. I'm just going off of what I've heard firsthand from some natives about what they have seen, what they have done,
Yeah,
and
I think
it's
vision.
spooky because I can't say that they can't transform into a coyote. Maybe they do. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I guess like these. So these in the legend that they're pretty much these witch doctors or shamans that can transform into animals, and if they can transform into all these different forms, how can you really say what was a skinwalker and what was the actual animal, except for like how they are acting?
Yeah, and there's been the interesting stories I've heard where like somebody says that this coyote, which coyotes will typically run away from people. They typically aren't going to hang around a person because they don't want to get shot. They're smart enough to know what a gun is. But there's been people who have said, this coyote was just following me, and then later it was acting weird. It was hanging around the house, and they did shoot at it. And then a neighbor up the street, has a wounded leg, like somebody shot him. And then they have to wonder, was that
Uh,
guy a skinwalker? And I've heard that story from natives a few times, and it could be a coincidence, could be just a bold coyote, but when they start tying it together in their cultural outlook, it really makes them wonder. So that's just something I've noticed, is there's so many variations that can be spooky.
yeah, and it's almost like if anything strange happens there, it's attributed to skinwalkers now.
More so, yeah.
And you mentioned that everything kind of had been trademark Skinwalker in this area, and like they control anything with that name on there. I'm sure that that doesn't go over well with the local tribes either.
I don't think so. It seems a little sleazy to me that they're, but it's like because they've got the TV show that's pretty popular, they don't want anybody else cashing in on the name, and that's why like the ranch just to the north is called Space Wolf Ranch, and then the one just to the south is something like UFO Valley Ranch.
And we got UFO Valley Campground, or are these the along this road here, or am I missing stuff?
Um, let's see. Right where your mouse is in the center, that's where the Sherman Ranch is. But just to your right is where Space Wolf is, and then to your left was the UFO Valley one.
Okay. Yeah. So this is like just desert here.
That's the top of the mesa.
Okay. And we've got the sacred stone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I got to go look at that because there's like markers, like there's a hole drilled through this big boulder, so it's like a sighting rock.
Oh, cool.
Like they want you to look through it, and then there's some other stuff that's geometric around it, which makes it seem almost like a very crude Stonehenge type thing in the sense that it's astronomical, probably.
Right. For stars or the sun or something.
Yeah. But somebody spent the time to drill a hole through one of the boulders there as like a sighting area to sight through. It was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it says Navajo Ute, so I guess they both have had this as a sacred spot.
Yeah. And it was a new thing to me. I wasn't even aware of it until we went up there.
Do you have any sort of tribal Native American legends in your own weird westerns that you're writing?
Um, I I have enjoyed just taking stuff that I've heard from people and using it in stories because I did set one story that I wrote right there. I don't use the name Skinwalker Ranch because they wouldn't have called it that, but I say that they're in the Mesa, and I just borrowed that for the sake of I'm trying. It's a fictional story, but I'm trying to keep it close to what it was, and it was interesting to use the idea that a Ute was explaining to my protagonist Porter Rockwell about this is a place where the river is always flowing, and he's like, there's no river here, and he's like, hey, even when the riverbed's dry, that's still a river. And I was trying to use the native explanation for how that force is always there even if you can't see it.
Yeah, in lots of different cultures, the rivers are also associated with uh, channels for spirits to travel
Yeah.
along. And so, which is your latest book here?
Bury Me Not is the most recent one I've done. And that one I was utilizing some of the Indian legends taking place around the Henry Mountains, which talk about giant rattlesnakes.
Oh, okay.
And I resist that because they say there's giant rattlesnakes that hide in the Henry Mountains, and there's a lost city in those mountains, and I couldn't resist trying to do a fun pulp weird western taking place utilizing some of the Indian legends of the area.
Yeah, so I see that your weird westerns has a lot of horror themes in it.
Yeah.
So it's pulp, it's horror, and western.
Yeah. It's like I like taking local legends and kind of playing around with that because I'm fascinated with that for my own life. The idea of what's out there. What have we missed in history? The way times change, and people start to think that stuff isn't there anymore because they get so hooked on technology that they're out of touch. So that's just something that drives my storytelling. Because, like I said, I'd always been, fascinated with, Bigfoot or Loch Ness monster since I was a kid, or ghosts, and I just take my own experiences and play with the stories that come out in my own head for that.
Yeah, so you're mentioning that this has been like an interest since you were a kid. How did like your experience at Skinwalker Ranch influence your? Did you get like a new understanding of the paranormal, or was there any sort of transformation at all?
Well, I honestly thought that I was going to go and not experience much, but I thought maybe we'd feel just a little bit of eeriness or creepiness. That's what I thought. I thought if I'm going to feel anything, it's probably going to be more on the negative aspect, and that we went and it felt so good, and the vibe was so positive and just energizing. It really did make me kind of go, oh, there can be two sides to every story here. Maybe I'm coming in at a time when it's just the good season. I don't know how to explain, because
Yeah,
I
so
didn't
yeah,
I didn't have negative to say about it.
even in European folklore with like fairy folklore, they have these portals, and it is strange that there are these concepts that are just like the world over, where you have these magical transformations, you have portals to other worlds, and it just seems strange that very separate cultures have such similar concepts.
Yeah, and that's one reason I think there is some kind of truth to it somewhere. And whether it's the missing 411 stuff being tied in with that, which the thing that makes the most sense to me is that it's tied in with some aspect of fae, some aspect of elemental nature,
Yeah,
and
and
that's all worldwide. You
yeah,
know.
and even across time, because we have these old folklore stories that sound so much like the new experiences that the Navajo people had shared with you.
Yeah, for sure. I'd heard some fascinating stories where they would say that there's this guy that can do out of body stuff, that he would go and spy on people. Then I heard stuff about skinwalkers harassing people, and then the concept that there's these dark witch doctor shamans that would monetarily, get paid off to put a curse on you, and then they might get paid off to lift the curse. That's They might have more power than you, but they're still falling to the base human nature of getting paid.
Good point. So I don't know if we've covered it. How did Skinwalker Ranch come by that name? Why was that chosen? Was the Skinwalker legend such a huge thing there, or because it there's when that came about, it was mostly about UFOs, and so I'm a little confused.
Right. With George Knapp and Colm Kelleher's book Hunt for the Skinwalker,
Hmm.
there was the mention that the place is on the path of the Skinwalker, that there's like a territory that the Skinwalker travels through, and that this is a place where there can be Skinwalkers, partly denoting the idea of like a doorway, a portal area. And
Okay.
popularity of the book, putting the title Skinwalker on it, is what really put the name Skinwalker Ranch on it. Because before that, it was the Sherman Ranch, the Gorman Ranch, and whatever it was before that.
Yeah, and it seems it kind of muddied the water a bit about what was happening there, even though it was just like a tangential name.
Yeah, and definitely when I first read the book Hunt for the Skinwalker, I was fascinated because of the title Skinwalker. Oh, I know what that is. And then the presentation in the book really made it lean more alien. And over time, I'm not so sure that there's a big difference between the idea of portals and skinwalkers and aliens not being maybe closer to the same trickster element in the first place than separate as much anymore. I don't know if that's making sense.
Yeah, it
The idea
makes
that maybe whatever this trickster element is, it can manifest as a lot of different things, and it's in its benefit to make us think that it's alien, but
it does make a lot
I'm
of
a little
sense.
inclined now to think that there's something with the trickster that's elemental is the closest word I can use.
Yeah, I think you're saying elemental because it's not like demonic or like a higher kind of entity.
Yeah, and that's not to say that I don't believe there can be demonic forces or that there can't be alien forces, but sometimes I wonder if it's not hard down to a trickster elemental force that likes to pretend and put on different masks.
Yeah, and you were saying that some people see it as aliens, I think, or UFOs. I think people are sort of going to that as the first thing because that's what they feel like that's something that can be backed up by science at least a little bit. Because with
Oh, definitely.
Carl Sagan back in the 70s was talking about there has to be aliens out there because there's billions of stars for them to be living around, and the possibility that there isn't some other life form is just crazy. But yeah, and in a lot of writings I see in the last 30 years, these old ideas are being presented as UFOs. Like there was a book I was reading recently about the Solomon Islands, where there's this like dragon snake that has red eyes and it kills people with its eyes and abducts peoples and eats them. And in his book he describes it as an UFO. So
Huh.
it even if the way that these things are described are very different, it just seems like the go-to is UFO and aliens currently.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now I want to know what that Solomon Islands book is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's Solomon's Mysteries, and it's Marius Borean.
Huh. I'll have
Um,
to look.
yeah, I can send you a link to it.
Sure. That'd be great.
But yeah, it was pretty fascinating because this was like a dragon experience they were having for years, and it was every other night. So it's not your common kind of dragon story.
Yeah.
Um,
And see, there's some interesting things that can tie in with that from like the native perspective is one of the first Spaniards that ever got shipwrecked and then hiked across America, and then he wrote a journal about it. Was his name was De Vaca,
okay.
and at one point they found a bunch of natives who were scared, and they were worried because they said there was something called Malacosa, Mr. Bad Thing, and Mr. Bad Thing was this weird little man that would show up every now and again and do things to them, like he had like some tool where he could like cut them open and then seal them back up so it's not killing them,
Crazy.
but it sounds like an alien that's doing experimentations and mutilations on them. And the Indians asked him where he lived, and he pointed that he lived in the crack in the ground. So he wasn't up in a UFO, but he was down in the earth, and it was, De Vaca and the other Spaniards, attributed it to something devilish and demonic, and that he wouldn't come back because they were Christians and they could keep him at bay, even though they were barely surviving, traversing the North America. But
Yeah,
it's
and
fascinating to look at it from our perspective. They looked at it as something demonic. We would look at it as like an alien mutilation thing. And to the natives, he was just some malevolent spirit that could manifest and do things to them.
yeah, in fairy folklore, they often talk about living underneath a hill or in the earth. So yeah, it is strange all of these connections, and it's
Yeah. And some of it's just your cultural outlook.
yeah, some of it. But I don't think it can explain all of it because these patterns are just too weird to and too separated by distance
Yeah.
to fully explain it.
Yeah, and that's the kind of mysteries that I'm just fascinated with, and it's like I want answers, and of course, there's some things you'll never have answers on, but I still like looking.
Yeah, and it's the journey, it's the search. That's what's most invigorating. So you definitely get it.
I try.
All
That's
right.
why when you mentioned Solomon Islands, I'm like, oh, that's a book I haven't read. I want to find that.
Yeah. I did like a short on it just recently here on YouTube, describing like what the natives experienced and what they were telling Borean about like their history and everything.
That's
Um,
cool. I love coming across that kind of stuff.
yeah. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about your weird westerns or anything else that you have currently running or coming up?
Well, I'm always fascinated by action adventure stories, and so it's like anything I have that's the stuff the pace has to keep going, so I try to keep it quick, that there's something going. I personally enjoy, the older pulp fiction that people might think has a little bit of purple prose, but it's because I love the language. I like to see words told in a beautiful way, not just basic, basic, basic. So I like to have a little bit of a descriptive flourish with my, you know, giant snake that's eating people that may or may not be a UFO or a giant snake. I'm more interested in the giant snake probably than the UFO.
It
But
so it sounds
I
like
have
you don't.
strong proactive characters that make things happen even when they get a lot of bad stuff thrown at them, that they find a way to come out on top, that they won't quit. And I think that's part of putting my own personality into it. Is a lot of bad things happen in life and you just have to keep going. So I like having characters thrown into strange, amazing, weird situations and seeing how they can come out on top. I enjoy having some humorous real world life type dialogue with them, where if you could still laugh in the face of danger, I like to have stories that do that. Um,
And it sounds like you tap into that sense of wonder where
yeah,
everything's not completely spelled out. It doesn't have like a hard science where everything is explained and systematic.
yeah, I definitely don't write hard science. My science fiction that I have written has been a little more pulpy. I've enjoyed doing weird stories like having astronauts fighting cosmonauts with a little bit of a sorceress bent. That's stuff that I heard about, and I thought, oh, that would make for a good story. And then I definitely do a lot of Conan the Barbarian type fantasy. And then my weird westerns, I pretty much use a real world person who existed named Porter Rockwell. He was a real person who was blessed by the Mormon prophet that, like Samson of old, if he didn't cut his hair, he could never be shot or stabbed. And that came true. So he grew his hair long. He was still a real hard drinking gunfighter, sometime lawman, sometime outlaw, but he didn't cut his hair and he was never shot and never stabbed, even though he was in the thick of things everywhere. It on some aspects, if you look up how many men it says he killed, it's more than 100. So he was definitely in a lot of scrapes, and I was fascinated by this real world person. So I use him as my main character in a lot of my weird westerns because I get to throw him into adventures and then figure out how do I put him in danger without him being shot or stabbed.
Yeah, and it also sounds kind of like a Geronimo kind of character too.
Yeah, to an aspect, yeah, yeah, because it's like he did die of old age without any bullet wounds or scars or anything. So it's kind of amazing, even on a real world aspect, And I was just fascinated with that for my main character for Weird Westerns.
Very cool
So
stuff.
that's him in right there at the bottom. Let Sleeping Gods Lie. Then there's a story of his in the next one, story in the next one, several stories in the next one. Scavengers is kind of a weird Western that has him too. Let Sleeping Gods Lie is based on a real thing that he did because he was in a California gold rush town that was actually named Murderer's Bar. That's how terrible the place was. And then I did utilize some stuff I read about where natives had found a bunch of giant skeletons unburied nearby where the 49ers were digging. And I started playing with that. What if I went with the Lovecraftian edge and explanation for some of those giant skeletons?
Oh, cool. Yeah, and if anybody is interested in any of David's books here, we have a link in the description and also in the show notes when it goes up on Spotify and iTunes.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
And we've also got a link to your Twitter if you want to follow David J.
Yep,
West
that's
there.
probably where I'm active.
And he does have a love for the paranormal, the strange. I have enjoyed following his account there for years. So do you have any last words, anything you'd like to promote before we go?
I just appreciate anybody that likes to check out my stuff if it would be of interest to them. There's the books, and then there's the audio books as well. And I just like talking to people that like talking about the same things I do. So I appreciate this conversation and having me on to just go back and forth about Skinwalker Ranch and all that.
Yeah, and it was a
So
very new perspective that I definitely appreciated, and I hope everybody out there appreciates too.
yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, great, and catch you later. Definitely see you out there in the wild on Twitter.
Yep.
All right, and thanks for coming, everybody.